Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming again. I hope, I think this should be fun. This is one of my favorite painting. I mean, we're back to Michelangelo. I was telling a group here in the front before that I actually, last time I was at the Vatican Museums, I got a big poster of the Last Judgement and put it over my bed. So it's a very, very beautiful fresco, and there's a lot going on, but hopefully, once we kind of break it down a little bit and zoom into certain parts, you'll kind of be able to see what's going on, and then we can learn more about our faith. So here's the title of the third part, The Last Judgment. So just to quickly recap, we did the ceiling 2 weeks ago. Then we did the walls last week, the life of Moses over here, the life of Jesus over here. We're in this picture, we're in the entrance of the chapel. So now we're going to be dealing with just one picture, which is called the Last Judgment. That's just back here. You can see, and then the main altar is down here. So Michelangelo did the ceiling, as we know. The walls were done by other artists before Michelangelo. And then about 25 years after Michelangelo did the ceiling, another pope asked if he would complete the chapel by doing the wall. He did have to take out some frescoes. I mentioned last week he had to take out the nativity of Jesus and Moses to make this grand fresco. And so this was completed between 1536 and 1541. So in the Last Judgment, here we'll just get to it. This is it. Here it is. This is Michelangelo 25 years after the ceiling. And so when it was completed, he was 67 years old. So we're dealing with, in his lifetime, a much older Michelangelo. And most art critics would say that, there is a certain kind of maturity in the art, that it's also a little bit darker. There's a kind of brightness and an optimism to the ceiling, but here he's dealing with some very dark and heavy themes and it's not without hope, but maybe there's just kind of a wisdom of age there. He's seen more of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And also another important thing is in between those 25 years, it was a really, really tumultuous time for the church. This is right in those 25 years is when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Thesis, and there was a Protestant Reformation. And really for us as Catholics, no offense to our Protestant brothers and sisters, but the Reformation is a bit of a misnomer for us as Catholics because it really was a rebellion. I mean, it was a rebellion against the Pope. It was a rebellion of what it meant to be Christian and to be Catholic. It was a rebellion in theology. It was a break, unlike any other break that the church had seen before. And it was in part due to corruption in the clergy and the papacy. Certainly, the clergy were particularly had a lot of fault in that of what led to it. But so there's also a lot of turnover, a lot of corruption with the papacy and stuff like that going on at this time. And so it was. I think people probably had a sense that things were never going to be the same, after the Protestant rebellion, we'll call it. So that happened in the meantime. And we'll see there's particular things that Michelangelo is putting in here that would have been a kind of reaffirmation of Catholic theology against what some of the Protestant ideas were. So in this fresco, there are over 300 distinct figures. So that's pretty impressive, right, within itself, that he took the time to do it. If you can kind of see it here better, but you notice that on the bottom here, the characters are a little smaller than the ones at the top. The reason for that is because when you're on the ground, he wanted them to all look the same size. So the ones that are farther away from your eye, when you're on the floor looking up, they have to be bigger proportionally so that it all looks kind of the same. Also, too, up here we've got so to kind of break this down and we're going to go into these parts, but it's kind of split in half right here. There's kind of a division between heaven and the top, and then the bottom, down here. And then within the bottom here, you've also got a division between hell and the damned, and you've got a division between that and the resurrection of the dead. And we'll go into all those different parts, but there's kind of it looks really complicated maybe at first, but once you kind of break it down, you can see there's a kind of clockwise motion. And that's one of the things that Michelangelo really captured really well, is that this fresco, there, especially when you see it in person, there's a lot of dynamism and motion, and it's a very dynamic and fluid thing. Like, people are flying at here and there and everywhere, especially, again, this is in the era way before movies or animation, so it would have been pretty wild to first set your eyes upon in that time period. But there's a kind of a clockwise motion here with this division between kind of heaven and then earth and then hell. So we'll go into all those parts. But before we go in, I just want to I want to talk a little bit about the second coming, since that's what this is depicting. It's depicting the moment when Christ comes back to judge the living and the dead. And that's something that we say every weekend. Every time we say the creed, we say that we believe that is going to happen. And not everybody believes that, by the way. But we do. We say, he will come to judge the living and the dead. Well, that's what's happening in this moment. And I've been trying to really emphasize in this series how we're in this story of salvation history. We dealt with the beginning, creation and the fall. We dealt with the middle with Moses, Jesus, and our lives. Well, now we're looking at a future event. This hasn't happened yet, but we believe that it will happen. Maybe it won't look exactly like this, but this is a pretty good attempt, based on what we know about what's going to happen. And I think that it's definitely worth mentioning, too, there is a really strong part of the Catholic tradition on a reflection on what's called the 4 last things. Some of you probably have heard of that before, but it's the 4 last things are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And those are things that we all are going to have to encounter at some point, right? Death, judgment, heaven, hell. And what's being depicted here is judgment, and then also heaven and hell. And obviously everybody's died, or so those are, and it's important for us to reflect on those things, because we know where we're headed. We know something about what is going to happen in this story. There's a way in which the ending, we already know what the ending is, even though there's still parts to be written. So it's good for us to reflect on those things, and that's what we're going to do here tonight. The other thing that's good to mention, too, is what's being depicted in the Last Judgment is what's called the general judgment, meaning at the second coming, Jesus is going to judge the living and the dead, and everybody will be there, whether you're in heaven, whether you're in hell, whether you're on earth. You'll be there for the general judgment. But there's also something called the particular judgment. And that's when each of us dies, we will go before the throne of God, and he will judge each one of us individually. And those two things complement each other. They're two distinct things. But so there is a sense in which it doesn't really matter when exactly the second coming happens, because the second coming the judgment of each of us is going to happen actually relatively soon. I mean, I don't know, Cassidy, I guess you're the youngest one here. So let's say that she has 70 years of life left. Well, 70 years really isn't that much longer before she's going to be judged, and all of us are going to be probably sooner than that, So the second coming, if in a sense, is going to happen for us very soon, whether or not it's at the actual second coming. So we want to keep that in mind too. And really what Michelangelo is doing for you here, and I wish I could take you there, because it really is spectacular when you're standing there, and these figures come alive. But he's giving you a front row seat at an event that you are going to be at. You're going to be somewhere in here. Maybe your soul's already in heaven, maybe not, But you're going to see this. And so when you come upon this fresco, it really does pop out at you, like you're getting a front row seat. Pope Paul VI, Paul III, sorry, the Pope at the time, when he saw it, it said that he in terror, was terrified by it. And he said, "Lord, please don't judge me on account of my sins," because it was just so terrifying, all these figures coming at you, So the other thing, too, before we get into it, that I think is really cool and important to talk about is, again, going back to this idea of a story. Well, with any story, we want to know, what is the ending of the story? Is the story a comedy or a tragedy? And while I was researching this, I found I found this quote from this author named Robin Schneider. It was a book. I've never read the book, but she wrote a book called The Beginning of Everything. It's a teen novel. Never read it, but I found this quote and I thought it was really interesting because I think it sums up what a lot of people think today, and it's this: life is the tragedy. She, the character in the novel, said bitterly. You know how they categorize Shakespeare's plays, right? If it ends with a wedding, it's a comedy, and if it ends with a funeral, it's a tragedy. So we're all living tragedies because we all end the same way, and it isn't with a damn wedding. This is a quote from the book, right? And that's a pretty bleak view, but in a certain sense, it's true because we know that we all are going to die. And if you don't, so the question is this a comedy or a tragedy? Well, we believe that no, that's not true, that what that character said is not true because we believe that this is a comedy. It's a happy ending. Why? Because it's going to be a wedding, a marriage between Jesus and the church. So yes, we do, there is the tragic element of the cross. But with the second coming and with heaven, that we believe that we go beyond the cross to life eternal, which is a wedding. And comedies, if you read like Shakespeare's comedies and stuff, they end often in weddings or even just popular Disney stories. They end in weddings, happily ever after. Well, this is a wedding. But it's important to note that just because it's a comedy doesn't mean it ends well for everybody, right? A comedy is defined based on whether it ends well for the protagonist. Well, who's the protagonist? Who's the protagonist of all of human history? It's Jesus. So it ends well for him because he conquers death. He is married and united to his bride, the church, and he rules as the king of creation. But that doesn't mean that it ends well for everybody because the bad guys, the wicked, they also get what's coming to them. So we also need to keep that in mind. And then the other, going along too with this theme of wedding, this is what I think is really pretty extraordinary, is that if you read, Jesus uses a lot of marriage metaphors in his ministry. And if the way that marriages worked in the time of Jesus was a little bit different than ours, they would have this period of betrothal. So a young man would propose to a young woman and they would be betrothed. But that was much more than like our engagement. When you were betrothed, you were legally married. So that's part of the conflict with Mary and Joseph. It wasn't just a matter of, we'll just call it off. They had to get a legal divorce if they were going to separate. So there's this period, and this is how marriages worked in Jesus' time, in the Jewish culture. A man and a woman would have this betrothal, this marriage contract. And then the way that it worked was the woman left her home to go to the man's family. She lived in the man's family house. So that was just how they did it. Well, after the betrothal, the man had to go back to his house and he had to prepare a place for her. And there was a time, because, you lived with all your relatives back then. So a man would go propose to a woman. They would make this marriage contract that was binding. But then they didn't actually live together yet because he had to go to his father's house, prepare a place for him and his bride to live in their house. And then after his father approved and said, okay, that's good enough, whatever, if he's building a room onto the house, then the father would say, okay, you can go get your bride. And then he would go in a big procession and he would get his bride and he would take her to live with him in the house. Well, so that this is, and what they would do is they would celebrate. Then the marriage was celebrated for 7 days. That's part also of the conflict that's going on at the wedding feast of Cana. It wasn't just one thing. It was they ran out of wine after a few days, and that was a huge source of embarrassment. But after 7 days, the couple would be married, and that's when they would consummate the marriage, and then they would be living together. Well, what happens with Jesus coming to heaven? Well, coming here. Well, he came here and he signed the marriage contract. He betrothed himself to us on the cross. Then he went to his Father's house to prepare a place for us. He tells us that. He prepares a place for us. And then when the time is ready, when his Father says the time has come, he is going to come again to take his bride, the church, to be with him forever. So the position that we're in right now is we are the bride waiting for our bridegroom to come and get us. He's already promised himself to us. He's already betrothed himself to us. We're just waiting for the party and for the consummation and for the eternal to go live with him in his Father's house. Well, so this kind of should hopefully shed some light on like some of the parables, like the parable of the 10 virgins. They're the bridesmaids basically. And so Jesus, what are they doing? They're waiting for the bridegroom to come and take his bride. Because think about if you're a Jewish bride in the first century, you don't know exactly when your husband is going to come, but he's coming at some point. Well, what if you just said, well, he'll come eventually, but I don't need to get ready right now. I'll wait to get ready, Well, what if he shows up and you're not ready to go, That's part of Jesus' warnings to us about be ready, be watchful. We need to be watching for him coming, just like a bride would be watching with expectation. How unfaithful would she be if she's like, well, I don't really believe that he's going to come and get me, so I'm just going to do my own thing or whatever. No, we're in the position of waiting for the bridegroom. So that's what the second coming is when our bridegroom is going to come to take us to be with him. Okay, so now we'll get, with all that says, let's get into particulars. So first, let's look at this group right here. And we'll blow it up. So here we've got the angels announcing the second coming of Christ. They're blowing trumpets to the four winds. And you notice that these two angels, one has got, there's two books. One has got the book of life, and the other has got the book of death. And I think it's worth reading. It's a short passage. St. John says the following. This is St. John's vision of this moment. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away. No place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, which is the book of life. What happened? Sorry. There's the book of life. And the dead were judged by what had been written in the books, by what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead in them. And all were judged by what they had done. So here we have the angels coming with the book of life and the book of death. Well, notice that the book of life is smaller than the book of death. So what does that mean? Does that mean that more people get into hell than into heaven? Or, well, that could be the case, but it also could be the case that if you're in the book of the damned, you're really proud. And what do proud people do? They write really big signatures. So maybe it's possible that the reason why this book is bigger is because all the damned wrote their signatures really big because they're proud. But those who are humble and obedient, they write in the lines and they, So really the question, so we don't really know, right? And there was a saint, I think it was Saint Bridget. She was worried one day about whether or not who's going to end up in, how many are going to end up in heaven and how many are going to end up in hell. And Jesus told her essentially, don't worry about it. I am fair. We're not going to get to heaven and be like, man, that's just not fair that they didn't get in, Or man, I mean, really, it's something that we maybe think to worry about now, but really, Jesus is going to take care of it. He is a good judge. He knows everything. He knows the heart, the human heart, and he's not going to be unfair. We're used to unfair judges, right? Because they don't know everything, or they're biased, or they're whatever. But Jesus is not like that. And so really, as far as the numbers, we don't need to worry about that. All we need to worry about is to be in this book and not this book. And that the size of the book doesn't necessarily mean that Michelangelo is saying more are in hell than heaven. But sometimes, to be honest, it doesn't always look good. But we don't know. And it's really not for us to worry about that. Okay. The other thing, too, to notice, these angels are really terrifying beings. When somebody encounters an angel in the Bible, it's usually not like a little cherub that's cute, They're terrifying beings. And so, part of that is it is going to be a great and terrible day. And these angels are going to be nothing, they're going to become visible, and it's going to be like nothing we ever saw. And you can really see that, in these figures by Michelangelo. So that's kind of the scene. So now we'll follow what Dante does in the Divine Comedy, and we'll go to hell first. We'll start at the bottom and then rise to the top. So here's hell. So we'll blow that up. So one of the things that I want to mention is we do have to affirm the existence of hell. It's not always fun, especially in our culture today. We don't want to think about it, but hell is real, right? And if nothing else, Jesus himself affirms multiple times that hell is real. And it can be hard for us to wrap our minds on, like, how would a loving God create hell? Well, the thing is God loves us so much, and he respects our freedom so much, that he even lets us choose against him. He doesn't force us to love him, and hell is a natural consequence of that. What makes hell is that it's separation from God, and that's miserable. But if you choose that, God respects that choice. He doesn't desire that anybody goes to hell, but it is a natural consequence of us having freedom. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter. We're not really free, because we're all going to be forced into heaven anyway. But John Henry Newman, now Saint John Henry Newman, he also had an interesting point about this, where he said, even if it was possible for someone who was damned to go to heaven, they wouldn't enjoy it. And the reason is because everything in heaven is about God. Well, if you don't enjoy God, you're not going to enjoy heaven. It would be like being at a party where everybody knows each other and everybody is having fun, and you're just a stump in the mud. Like it wouldn't be enjoyable for those people, because the things that they held on to in this life, God has taken them away, because it's all about God in heaven, and they wouldn't enjoy that. It's also, too, it's a sign of God's justice, right? God's justice is not opposed to his mercy. They at justice and mercy kiss in heaven, and in the after this life, as the Bible says. But it is a requirement of God's justice that he does hold us accountable for our deeds. Otherwise, like I said, we're not free. So here we can see the damned going into hell, and it's Michelangelo does a really good job of like showing in their bodies the struggle and the fight. And these people, they're not very repentant, but they're still trying to fight their way out of what their fate is. And so we can see, people about this guy right here. This is Charon. He is actually a figure from Greek mythology. He was the figure who ferried the damned souls into Hades in Greek mythology. So Michelangelo's incorporating that kind of in here, and he, he's about to smack these guys with this oar. I also wonder too. I don't know if Satan is particularly. There's no one figure that looks like Saint. Oh, that's definitely Satan. It could be that this is supposed to be Satan, but it definitely is the Charon, the fairy, the guy who ferries the souls to the dead in the afterlife. And that's also, by the way, in the Divine Comedy by Dante. I don't know if I talked about that. Yeah, decommission.
Is that the river Styx?
Yeah. In Greek mythology, it is. Yeah, it's that story. So he's ferrying them across. And we've got these people struggling but they're they don't have a choice. They're going to hell. So also too, we have up here the souls that are still trying to fight their way into heaven. This is not out of repentance. This is out of rebellion. And there are some interpretations that they represent the 7 deadly sins. Some of them are maybe a little easier to pick out than others. But this guy, if you can see, he's got like a money bag right there. So he would be avarice. This guy is being grabbed by the genitals, so he would be lust. I don't know about this one. Maybe this person getting carried away could be sloth. It's not a 1-to-1, but there's something possibly to be said for that. But they're being backed up by the angels who aren't letting them in. Up there. And then I think that this guy in particular is really important or good to center on, because Michelangelo has really captured kind of damnation in one face, I think. This guy, he can't even look, he's covered up with his face because he can't even bear to look at what's coming for him. And, in his face, it's not repentance. He sees his choices for what they are, and he also is kind of resigned to his fate. So it's not, I just think that there is something about the way that Michelangelo captured this guy's face that really sums up what it is. He's not repentant. He's not sorry for what he did, but he sees the consequence of his actions, and he sees that it's finally caught up to me. And he doesn't even want to bear to look at where he's headed, but that's where he's headed. And he's being dragged down there by demons, So I think that, I wanted to focus on his face just because, it's just brilliant how Michelangelo is able to really depict that, and because of just kind of the horror that it is for these souls. And then also, this is kind of funny, but they always point this out. This guy is Minos. He, in Greek mythology, was a king who went to Hades, and then his job was to, once the souls got to Hades, it was his job to assign them a place. So he wasn't their judge per se, but it was his job. And what would happen is his tail, he would wrap his tail around his body, and then that, however many times he wrapped his tail around his body, that's the circle of hell or Hades that you went into. And so that's Minos. Well, the funny story with this is that Michelangelo hadn't finished yet, and the papal master of ceremonies, the guy who was in charge of all the papal liturgies, he made a comment that it was inappropriate for Michelangelo to have all these nudes and all these, lewd figures up here. What he said was lewd figures. And Michelangelo overheard him, so he drew his face from memory, and so this is that guy. And he drew him with donkey ears, because that symbolizes stupidity. He also, I don't know if you can't see it as well, and this was actually only recently uncovered when they did the restorations, but this snake is biting his genitals. So anyway, this guy, this papal masters of ceremonies, came in and said to the Pope, he was appalled, and he said, Holy Father, you have to get this out of here, because he knew it was him that Michelangelo had put there. And Pope Paul III said, he's reported to have said, God has given me authority in heaven and on earth, but my jurisdiction does not extend to hell. You'll just have to put up with it. Because the Pope recognized that this art is brilliant, and he wasn't going to mess with the master's artwork, So anyway, that's kind of a funny story. The tour guides always love to point that out, and it is a true story, but it's, So that's what Michelangelo thought of that guy. But anyway. Also, I don't know, another candidate maybe for where is Satan incarnate is maybe this guy back here. He's kind of ominous, and he looks like he's kind of happy with the proceedings. I think one thing, though, that I do want to mention is, one question is, do the demons, get a kind of pleasure out of torturing people? And because in a way, there was a time where that kind of bothered me, because it was well, why do they get, pleasure out of it? But, one of the things is for the demons, they know that by torturing souls, it's going to be worse for them. They don't get any real pleasure out of it, but they do it anyway. So the more that they torture souls, the worse it is for them. And their punishments are going to be much worse than humans, because they're angels, and they should have known better. We should know better too, but they, So I don't think that, it's not like they do get a kind of sick pleasure, but it doesn't last, and it just makes it worse for them. So, it's going to be miserable to be a demon. Or it already is. But anyway. Move through hell. And now we'll move to the other side. And this is a little bit different. So here, on this side, we see the resurrection of the dead. This is also something that we say every single week, and we don't even necessarily think about it. I believe in the resurrection of the dead, or the resurrection of the body. And believe it or not, this was actually one of the most controversial and scandalous things for the earliest Christians in Greek culture. Because the Greeks had this idea, like with Plato and stuff like that, the spirit and the body, and that the higher part of us is our spirit, which is true. But they thought, if we could only just leave the body, do you ever feel that way sometimes? Like, if only I could just leave my body and then I'd be a pure spirit and then I would just float and be happy. Well, you can't, because you're a body-soul composite. That's what a human being is. So, but the Greeks thought, that was they had this idea of the spirit leaving the body and then I'll be free. Well, as Christians, we don't believe that. We believe in the goodness of the body, and we believe that the body will be redeemed. Which was kind of a hard sell at first for some of the Greeks. When Paul goes to Athens, the thing that they get hung up on is the resurrection. They're following him when Paul's preaching to them, and then Paul says, the resurrection of the body, and the Greeks are like, what are you talking about? Like, the whole point is to try to escape the body. But that's not what we believe, because we believe that the body is good. Also, the thing with the resurrection of the body is that it really does display not only God's goodness in creating us with bodies, but also his power. In Ezekiel, there's a famous scene where Ezekiel sees a preview of this with the dry bones. I don't know if you remember that story, where Ezekiel sees dry bones, and God basically says, can these dry bones, Ezekiel, do you think that I could make these dry bones live? And Ezekiel's like, well, I don't know, you're God. And then God's like, well, watch this. And then all of a sudden, flesh comes on their bones and they rise. Well, that was a preview of what's going on here. So Michelangelo has given us, there's actual, I didn't blow him up, but you can see a skeleton here. He's kind of looking up. He's like, oh, here I am, And people are rising, and they're receiving their bodies back. Their dry bones they're receiving their bodies back. And so, again, this is something that we believe is going to happen. It's also previewed, and we'll get to these two figures, but it's also previewed by Jesus and Mary. Jesus' body ascended into heaven, so his body exists in heaven. And then we just celebrated the Assumption a few weeks ago. Mary also was assumed into heaven. She received her body. It's also, I think it's poetic that right now there is a male and a female body in heaven right now. At the very least, we know that. So the body is good. And I mentioned this a couple weeks ago that, the thing that makes Michelangelo such a master is he was really a student of the human body. And, it caused a little scandal on one hand, but it also, he really took the time to really draw these bodies very accurately. So just to highlight a couple of these figures, here we see, unlike the hell side, we see similarly, we see a struggle between angels and demons fighting for souls. But on this side, the angels are winning. So the angels are taking these souls with their bodies up, but there is a drama here. There is a real struggle, because this demon is trying to pull this guy down. This guy's got, a snake wrapped around him. And again, the brilliance of Michelangelo, that you can see how weighty these bodies are. It really is a struggle to pull them up, And yeah, that is. So I think that, just because we're Christians and we believe, we hope that we'll be saved, that doesn't mean that there isn't spiritual warfare, and that there's a real drama and a real struggle and a real fight for individual souls between angels and demons. And ultimately it comes down to whether or not we choose to accept God's grace or not. But just because these people are on this side of the frame doesn't mean that there's not a struggle there, and that there's not a kind of drama. And again, a spiritual warfare would be another way to look at it. It also highlights the importance of the saints and angels in helping us. So another example, we talk about the communion of saints. Well, they are rooting for us, and they're helping us on. They're like our older brothers and sisters who have already ran the race, and they're helping us on. Well, we've got angels down here. We also have up here we have this guy, and he is pulling up these two figures by what looks like rosary beads. People think that that's what they are. We don't know for sure, but they look like rosary beads. And part of this, I talked about how Michelangelo was kind of putting in some Catholic contra-Protestant stuff. Well, part of what this is, saying is that our prayers and our merits do matter. That yes, we're saved freely by God. God's saving us as a free gift of grace. But he wills that we participate in our salvation, meaning that when we say the rosary or when we pray or when we ask for the saints' help, that is part of what helps saves us. Even though it doesn't take away from God saving us, it actually enhances God saving. That's different than a Protestant mentality, which is more, God just says you're good. Well, this is really oversimplifying, but God just says you're good, and then you're like, well, I'm good. No, God wants us to participate in our salvation, and that's through saying the rosary and stuff. Also, there's also, in Michelangelo's time, there wouldn't have been a whole lot of, there would have been some, but not too many Africans in Italy. But here we have, there's also, while they're not probably fully represented, admittedly, he does have, people of multiple races represented here too. That the resurrection from the dead is not just one people, but it's going to be all the nations. Probably could have put a little more diversity in there, but that is in there a little bit. So there is speculation about who this is. Maybe it's Saint Dominic, because he was the one that Our Lady gave the rosary to. We don't really know, but that's a possibility. But either way, he's a saint who's helping out these people to pull them up to get to heaven. And then the last character I kind of want to highlight, and you can see that's what's all happening up here too with all these people. They're being helped out by the angels and saints to be risen from the grave. The last one, and you might have missed this one, but he's kind of hiding, but he's there, is down there. Here we have Michelangelo giving a subtle reference and a highlight of the priesthood, the ministerial priesthood, because this guy we know is a priest. We know that because he has what's called a tonsure. For monks, they used to shave the tops of their heads, and that was a sign that they were a monk or a priest. And so this guy is a priest, and he's blessing or absolving this soul. So, even though we're at the end of the world here, this priest is still kind of on the ground, if you will, doing his job. He's kind of like a medic in a war field or something, and he's still, exercising his priestly ministry to absolve this soul or whatever, or give it anointing the sick or whatever, And so, it's just kind of a nice, interesting little thing that Michelangelo put in there. Also, contrary to the Protestants, who at the time were really questioning the necessity of the priesthood. That was one of the big things that they eventually threw out. So there's the priest right there.
Michelangelo was Catholic, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, he was a devout Catholic. Yeah, probably not a saint, not a canonized saint, but very, very devout, very pious. You'll have some people who will try to argue that, here and there, like, well, you can see this in his art, like he was pushing Protestant ideas, and I don't know, I don't really buy that. I think that's kind of after the fact, but from all accounts, and not just from his paintings, but from his writings, we know that he was a devout Catholic. He's not as well known as a writer and a poet, but he did write a little bit. So, oh, I should point this out too. You see this spot right here? That spot is a spot they left when they did the restoration. So this dark blue color was what the entire thing looked like until the 1980s. So I didn't put in a picture of what it looked like. They did take a picture of it before they restored it. But if you can imagine, that dark all across, there were certain things that you couldn't see because it was covered up by, soot, dust, whatever, I don't know, the accumulation of years of stuff. So when they restored it, they left some of these squares just to show the contrast. So you can imagine, when they restored this fairly recently, 30, 40 years ago, how everything popped anew. Because it looked good, but it was still it looked very dingy and very dark. So that's an example. There's another one down here, and you can see them. They're kind of hidden all over, but not on the main figures, but just to give you an idea. Okay, so now we're going to rise and we're going to focus on heaven or the celestial court. So one of the things that I think is an important principle when we're talking about art in churches is the idea is to make the invisible visible. So we believe that, God creates the invisible and invisible. We say that every week. We believe in invisible realities that we can't see, but we believe are there, like the angels and the communion of saints and that kind of thing. Well, part of what good art in churches do is to help make visible the invisible mysteries of whatever we're doing in the Mass or in whatever. So why do I say that? Well, I think that, why do you put this in a chapel? The artist is trying to unveil what is happening at the Mass, that the communion of saints centered around Christ is present. And we don't see that, but the idea of the art is for those of us who are on earth, when we look at something like this during Mass, because this is a chapel, that our minds are focused then on what is really going on here, even though we can't see it. It's the same, it's not quite as dramatic, but it's the same in St. Matthew's with the cross. There's a crucifix, a really nice crucifix, by the way, in St. Matthew's. And everybody is looking at that because what's being presented on the altar is the mystery of Christ crucified and given up for us, right? And the idea of that art is to help our minds focus on that reality that's being presented. Well, that's what's going on here, is it's bringing to the visible the invisible communion of saints that's surrounding Christ. And so I think, why are all of these saints, quite frankly, jacked? Like they are look at these figures. They're muscular, they're ripped, they're huge. Well, what I think, I guess what my interpretation of it would be is what St. Paul talks about. St. Paul talks about athletes. He uses athletes as examples for us of being spiritual athletes. He talks about how athletes will give up all kinds of things and they'll be tough on their bodies in order to run the race for a perishable crown. And he says, but we run for an imperishable crown, right? So what Michelangelo is showing us by making these figures, again, certainly he was a student of the human body, but by making these figures buff and strong, he's showing us these saints are the spiritual athletes. They're the ones who have run the race that we're running. We don't normally see that when we're walking around. We don't see who the spiritual athletes are. But Michelangelo is trying to lift the veil to show us, here are spiritual athletes, the men and women who have ran the race, who have kept the faith, and who are now in heaven. And they're almost deity-like. They're almost kind of a fulfillment of the Greek gods. I think that the Greek gods in mythology, they don't so much tell us about God as much as they tell us about mankind, the Greek god. Well, these saints are kind of the fulfillment of those archetypes. They're not Greek gods, but they kind of are God. They're godlike because we become like God, and they're kind of the fulfillment of the best attempts of humanity to make up gods. Well, that's kind of fulfilled in the communion of saints. They're not God, but they are glorious in their own right in and through Christ. So I think that what you're seeing here is you're seeing the spiritual athletes who are cheering us on below, right? And I think, the guy who probably looks the toughest, right, is this guy. He looks really tough. This is St. Lawrence, because he's got his grill. He was the one who was, he was a deacon in Rome in the 4th century, and he was arrested, and they asked him to bring him the treasures of the church, and so he brought the poor, and then they put him on a gridiron. And then he's also the patron saint of humor because he was on one side and he said, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." And so, while he's being martyred. Well, St. Lawrence, why do we hold up the martyrs so great? The martyrs are the spiritual athletes par excellence. St. Lawrence maybe wasn't this buff in real life, but now in heaven, in all his glory as a martyr, he gave his life for Christ, and that's what all these saints have done in one way or another. Okay, so anyway, so that's kind of a more general, like, why do these people look like they do? Up here in the lunettes, you have the instruments of Christ's passion. So you have the cross, the crown of thorns, and the scourging at the pillar. So that's what's going on there. And it's kind of like, well, let's talk about this now, but it's almost like Christ they're the cause of both the salvation for the just, and they're the cause of damnation for the damned, because you either accept or reject the cross and the passion. And if you accept it, then you repent, you go to heaven. If you reject it. So it's kind of like, I talked earlier about the marriage. It's like Christ, the instruments, or the marriage contract, if you will, is the passion and the cross. So he's kind of bringing proof that, like, my bride is mine, and I've redeemed her through these instruments and through these wounds that are in my hands, And those of you who are rejected, the damned, that's also the cause of your damnation, and insofar as you have rejected me, So he's kind of bringing his proof, if you will, that he's coming to reclaim his bride. Okay, and then, I have to mention this because this does come up every time that you get into the Sistine Chapel, and it's an important subject, is what do we make of the nudity in the Sistine Chapel in general, but particularly with the Last Judgement, but also the ceiling. Because really, actually, Michelangelo had more, shall we say, exposed people than what we see. And you can kind of see how some of these loincloths are really like artificial, they're very strategically placed. That's because about, I don't know how many years, it was a couple decades after Michelangelo died, there was controversy over having nude people in a chapel, in the Pope's chapel particularly. And so one of Michelangelo's associates painted loincloths over many, not all, but many of the figures, because it was controversial. And so I think that, was Michelangelo pushing the limits? Certainly. But I don't think that it was totally inappropriate. And I think, because I think that what nudity symbolizes, right, is spiritual. Again, we're trying to make visible invisible realities. Nudity symbolizes spiritual transparency. So, like, think about Adam and Eve in the garden. They were naked and they were not ashamed. Well, what happened when they fell was they were ashamed. And I don't think that it wasn't so much a sexual thing. There was an element of that, but really it was more that they saw that they were exposed and that they didn't trust God, because now I'm exposed and I'm going to die, and I know that, And the sexual element is involved in that, but I don't think that's the primary element. I think it's that they realized they were vulnerable. They realized they were vulnerable because they were going to die, and so they hid. And so God asks them, where are you? Why? Because he didn't know where they were? No, because he was giving them an opportunity to come and be transparent with him. Who knows? Like, if they would have said, God, we're sorry, we took the fruit, maybe he would have forgave them right then and there. But they hid from them. He said, we hid because we were naked. We hid because we were vulnerable. They weren't transparent with God. So I think one of the lessons that we can take from that is we need to be spiritually transparent with God in our prayer. If we are praying and we hide things from God, we're just like Adam and Eve in the garden, and that God knows what our sins are, and he knows what we struggle with, and he knows the deepest, darkest things about it. He knows us better, but he wants us to tell him. Why? Because he wants us to be transparent with him, because you can't be in a relationship with somebody if they're not going to be transparent with you. It's not that God needs to learn anything from us, because he doesn't need to learn anything, but we need to be spiritually transparent, spiritually naked, if you will. We can't hide from him like our first parents did in the garden in prayer. Also, so that's one thing to do that in your personal prayer in church, and you should do that. Be transparent with God. Tell him everything. Even if it's not the quote-unquote correct thing, read the book of Job. Job says some things that aren't like correct in the sense of, he's angry with God, and why would you do this to me, God? But he doesn't abandon God. He tells him everything, and then he listens to God. Well, that's what we should do. So be transparent with God in your prayer, but also be transparent with God in the confessional. That's another temptation for us, right? Is that we go to the confessional and we hide from God, even in the confessional. And when we, to do that is to do exactly what Adam and Eve did. They make their first sin worse by hiding. So there is a spiritual principle here with nudity, like spiritual transparency, not hiding from God, because God sees everything, right? To be willing to be vulnerable with him in that way. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. Well, so one of the questions is like, are there clothes in heaven? Well, yes and no. If you ask the mystics, what they say is no, in the sense of we will all be transparent to God and to each other. We will see everything. Yes, physically, but more importantly, we will see everything spiritually. That's kind of a horrible thought, right? But we will also see not only all of each other's faults, we will also see how those faults were redeemed by Christ. So they won't be sources of sadness in heaven. We will know each other in a more intimate way just by the fact that we know where each of us has fallen, and we also know where everybody has been redeemed. So there will be a certain kind of transparency. But with the mystics, most of the mystics, what they say when they have visions of heaven is like, it looks like people are both clothed and unclothed, because on one hand, they're so transparent that there's a kind of nakedness there because everybody is who they are. But also, they are clothed with their merits, meaning the things that they have done by God's grace. And it's almost like those clothes have been like grafted onto them, the clothes of their merit. So it's kind of I don't know, who knows? We'll see what it looks like. But also, along with this theme, I think that a really good book, if you're really interested in this kind of stuff, is Peter Kreeft has a book called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Heaven But Never Dreamed of Asking. And he asks all kinds of questions in there that you'd be surprised. It's really fascinating. It's a good read. You don't have to read it, but it's if you're interested in like what will heaven be like. He's a really smart guy who, doesn't get into. He's very faithful to what we know heaven is going to be like, but he also has some kind of fun conjecture based on what we know. And so he asks all these kinds of questions. And anyway. I'd recommend that. And I'd recommend anything by Peter Kreeft. And he's very accessible. He's not, he writes very well for everybody. Okay, but I do need to say, so yes, nudity, the body is not bad. However, going back to creation, we are created good, but we are also fallen. And right now we're in the fallen state. So the people who didn't want the nudes displayed on the Sistine Chapel, they weren't simply just prudes. Like, they do have a point, because the body now in our fallen state has become a temptation for us. Why? Because we stop at the body. We don't see through the body to the person. We stop at the body and fixate on that. So I think that those people had a point, right? That it can be a source of temptation and a source of struggle for us, and we need to guard against that. One of probably the best example, actually, is Christ on the cross. He was almost certainly crucified naked because the Romans didn't spare any humiliation. It's also a reversal of the fall. Adam was naked in the garden at the tree. Jesus is hung naked on the cross. He would have been utterly... The Romans, if they're stripping off his clothes and beating him, they're not going to give him the courtesy of a loincloth, right? However, we don't display that in our churches, because it would be more of a distraction and would take away from the point of why we, so that's just a good example of, the body is good, but we need to recognize that we are fallen. And John Paul II, in Theology of the Body, he had an interesting quote where he said, the opposite, it's not that he was talking about pornography. It's not that pornography doesn't show too much, it shows too little, right? We stop at the body and we don't see the person, right? And that's where it can be a real hang-up for us in this fallen world. So we do need to keep that in mind. Okay. He also says, too, in the theology of the body, this is worth mentioning, that the opposite of to love is not to hate, but to use. And that's a temptation with each other, to use each other in ways that are not good. Not just with the body, but that can be a hang-up. Okay, so now we're going to focus on Jesus and Mary, the central figures of the whole thing. And you can see that here we have the new Adam and the new Eve reigning. Jesus is actually based on a statue of Apollo, who was the sun god. Not that Michelangelo is saying that he's Apollo, but it's kind of like he's kind of the fulfillment of everything that Apollo tried to represent. But it was based off of a statue of Apollo that had recently been found. And he's got a very youthful but powerful figure and face. He's larger than life. I mentioned his wounds. He is pronouncing judgment upon the damned. And he's kind of showing them his wounds. Again, like, you've rejected me, and you've rejected what I've done for you, We've also got the figure of Mary, who it's said that Michelangelo spent the most time on the figure of Mary in this fresco, because he wanted to get her right. And one thing that you'll notice is, usually her arms are open, but Michelangelo has drawn her arms crossed. Why? Well, because it's the end of the world. The time for intercession is over. So she's not interceding anymore, because now we have the final judgment. So everything's been done. So she's not interceding. She's kind of in humility, accepting the judgment of her son. But it's also interesting too how Christ kind of has his focus on the damned. He's justice, and she is kind of the gateway to mercy. Christ's side, which was split open and from which blood and water poured out, is right here, and she's kind of nestled up to his side, like she's like the gateway to his tender mercy. And that she's kind of got his vulnerable side, if you will, and that to come to his side, you have to go through Mary. She's the mother of mercy. I mentioned that title in the prayer, right? So I think he's kind of got that, going on there. And she's focused not so much on the damned, but she's focusing on her children and those who are coming to be with them in heaven. So she also is a representative of the church. She's a figure of the church. She is Christ's bride. She's his mother. She's also his bride par excellence. And that, they're, again, the new Eve, the new Adam. And so there is a way in which, she representing the church is united to Christ, the bridegroom. And she represents all of us in that sense. Okay, so now we'll look at these saints over here. Again, you can see, there's all this activity and stuff going on. It's not totally clear, especially on this side, who all these figures are. We know that this guy, you can see a great view of him, is St. Andrew, because he's got an X-shaped cross, because that's what Andrew was crucified on. We don't really know who this guy is. The two probably most likely candidates are either John the Baptist or Adam. John the Baptist kind of gets a vote because of this camel's skin. But then again, Adam was also clothed with animal skin after the fall. So that doesn't really rule out Adam. But I also wonder too, if it's Adam, because there's this guy, and we don't really know who he is, but he's young. There's some speculation that he is Abel, who is the first just man, the son of Adam and Eve who was murdered. Because he's kind of with, if this is Adam, he's with his dad, if you will. And then, since these three figures are so prominent, maybe this is Eve, because we don't really know who this is either. She certainly represents a very maternal figure, because she's right on the edge of these people who are being received into heaven. It's kind of like, imagine somebody hanging off a cliff and, you pull them up and then there's kind of that moment of relief, I made it. Well, she's the mother, this mother figure. So, she could very well be Eve, and then that would be Adam, Abel, and Eve. And then Eve who was the mother of all the living, finally is kind of redeemed. Her children finally come home, not because of her, but she. So who knows? And then other than that, we really don't know with the rest of them. Like, they're kind of nondescript. We don't really know who all the particular figures are, but there's all this activity and so. But if we look at the other side, and also again I mentioned St. Lawrence right there. If we look at the other side, we do have a few more figures who are identifiable. So certainly very prominently is St. Peter right here. But you'll notice something interesting. So he's holding the keys, but the keys are missing the head or what's it called? The bow. You know how a key has a turning part, the bow. Why? Because there's no need anymore for him to unlock and close the gates of heaven. Everything's already over. He's handing back his authority to Christ. There's no turns dial anymore. There's no need for the keys. He's giving them back to Christ. They're like these little baton things. And remember, this is the Pope's private chapel. So part of it is a message to the Pope that to remember that your authority comes from Christ and one day you're going to give it back to him. That you're not an absolute authority. Behind him is St. Paul, because Peter and Paul go together. Paul is also a lot of times portrayed with a longer beard. So that's Peter and Paul. These two figures, it's speculated they might be Adam and Eve. They could also be Abraham and Sarah. I don't know, take your pick. We don't really know. But also, I think it's really interesting if you look back at the detail here. It's like a family reunion. You've got like these two guys look like brothers that are embracing. Here you've got two they almost look like lovers, like maybe a husband and wife who are reunited. So that is going to be part of heaven. Like, we're going to be united to Christ and we're going to live forever with him, but we will also be all reunited with each other. And the bonds that we have with our brothers and sisters and friends and family and even spouses, they're not going to be negated in heaven. They're going to be transformed. And so it's not a matter of either or. Now maybe this is a little dramatic. I mean, about we're going to be primarily focused on Christ, but we're going to also love each other in and through him. So even with married couples, sometimes it can disturb people that there's going to be no marriage in heaven, so am I just going to be indifferent to my spouse? No, your relationship is going to be transformed to the highest pitch of love that's possible. Think about, have anybody done marriage prep 101 where there's the triangle and there's the husband, the wife, and then God. And then the farther along you are up on the triangle, the closer you are to God, the closer you are to each other. Have you ever heard that? Kind of as an analogy for marriage? That one of the things you want to teach couples is that, the closer you are to God on this triangle, the closer you are to each other, right? Well, imagine in heaven, the husband and the wife are both united with God on the point. They're going to be as close to each other as you could possibly get, right? So your relationship, yes, you're not going to be married, but it's going to be because we, the bride of Christ, there's one marriage. We're going to be married to God, and we will be closer to each other because of that, because we will love each other in and through God perfectly. And all your relationships with people on earth will be transformed. They won't be annihilated. So, don't it's not going to be like you get to heaven and you say see your husband or wife hey, good to see you again. We had some good times. No, it's going to be at the highest pitch possible of love because it's in and through God. Okay, who else we got here? Let's see. Down here we can identify him. It's Saint Sebastian. He's got his arrows. He's also kind of, these people down here, remember, they're above the people fighting to get into heaven. So they're kind of also helping fight them off. And Saint Sebastian was a pretty tough guy. He got pierced with arrows multiple times. Well, he's kind of holding him up as a sign of his martyrdom. This is St. Catherine of Alexandria, because she has the spiked wheel, which is what she was martyred on. St. Blaise, he has these these steel combs, because that's what he was tortured with. All the saints, they are similar idea with Christ and the cross. The reason why the saints are depicted with the instruments of their martyrdom is because that's their glory, that they have conquered death. And so it's a sign of their glory. Here we have St. Simon the Zealot, because he has a saw. He was not crucified. He was martyred with a saw, so that's pretty brutal. And then, probably most famously, we have St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew was an apostle, so is Simon the Zealot, by the way. St. Bartholomew was an apostle, and he was filleted alive. And so we've got him with the knife and his skin. Interestingly, though, and most artists, scholars agree, that they believe that this is a self-portrait of Michelangelo. This skin, he drew his own self-portrait into the skin. So remember, he's 67 years old, he's kind of at the end of his life, and it's possible, there's a story of the god Apollo and this Marsyas, who was challenged Apollo to a music contest, Greek god Apollo, and he lost this satyr, and so he was filleted alive because of his pride. So there is an interpretation that maybe what Michelangelo is saying is he knew that he was very prideful earlier in his career, and he's hoping that he will be judged mercifully by Christ, unlike the story from Greek mythology where that satyr who challenged the Greek god Apollo was flayed alive. Also, if you notice too that if we go back, Christ is like almost directly looking at St. Bartholomew and this skin, so it's almost like he's being judged, and he's being judged by Christ in this very moment. And then there's also kind of St. Bartholomew, it almost looks like the skin's about to slip out of his fingers. So and what's he hanging over? He's hanging over hell. So, Michelangelo, who knows what he's thinking at this time in his life? He's hoping for merciful judgment, but he also knows his past sin, that he's kind of feels like a skin of a man, at this point, and he's hoping for mercy, but he also knows that, he's kind of on the brink. And then, so again, this is all, we don't know all how, it's not unlikely that all this is true, but another kind of maybe key is that, or it's just interesting, is that you can draw a straight line from the cross, through the crown of thorns, through the Christ who's the judge, through the filleted skin, through the damned man who's the most prominent figure outside of the heavenly court, into hell. And so it's almost like, and who's right in the middle? Like Michelangelo. So it's almost like he's kind of in the balance between heaven and earth, Who knows if that's what he intended, but I wouldn't put it past him. I mean, he certainly, would have had maybe something like that in mind. Okay, so just a few final thoughts. I've been trying to emphasize that this is our story. And my whole goal, I hope, was to really get us into our story. This hasn't happened yet, meaning that we are in the middle of the story. We are the bride of Christ, the church. We're waiting patiently for our bridegroom. So we don't want to be that bride who's like, well, I'll just put off. He's coming, or I don't really believe that he's coming because, it's been a while or whatever. So we want to be that bride who is waiting for her husband with excited expectation, and that we can't wait until he comes because, and one of the ways that, and we say this every time at Mass, right? What do we right after the priest lifts up the host? We say, the mystery of faith. We proclaim your death, O Lord, and profess your resurrection until you come again, or save us by save us. All of those acclamations that we say right after the Eucharist is all of them as the church saying to our bridegroom, "Come, Lord Jesus, Maranatha." That's what Maranatha means, by the way. So that's the bride saying, "Come" to the bridegroom, because we want this to happen. We want to go to the marriage feast that lasts for 7 days and is a great party and the wine never runs out, And I think that one of the ways that we can do this in each of our lives is to make frequent acts of faith, hope, and love. say often throughout our day, Jesus, I trust in you. Jesus, I hope in you. Jesus, I love you. I'm waiting for you, with excitement. And I think that's what we are meant to embody here on this earth. So the second coming is not something to be terrified of for a Christian. It's something to look forward to. It's something to look forward to because it's the consummation of all of history, where we finally enter into that eternal rest and the eternal bliss of heaven. So that's all I got. I don't know if anybody has any questions or any discussion. We have a little more time than we did in the past couple of weeks. I tried to end a little early, but yeah. France.
Cremation, in the body and spirit, what's the church view on cremation?
It's a good question. So for many years, cremation was not allowed because it was a kind of offense against this belief in the resurrection of the body. For various reasons, as time went on, the church allowed it. And the current teaching of the church, and the reason is because God, while there is something to be said for burying with your body whole, because it is an anticipation of the resurrection of the body, God isn't limited by, like, if your body is ashes. He's not going to be limited by, well, I guess I can't put them back together now. I mean, he can create out of nothing, right? So he can recreate you out of nothing. And it will be really your body, even if you're cremated. So the current church's teaching is that it is allowed as long as you're not doing it in defiance of the teaching of the resurrection of the body. Because that was the big fear for many centuries, was that, you didn't want people to be like, well, I don't believe in the resurrection of the body, so I'm going to incinerate it. So, as Catholics, we're very respectful of the body, even the dead body, because this body will one day rise again, and so that's why if you go to Europe, they have bodies everywhere. Like, you go inside a church there and you'll see that underneath the altar is a body or bones or whatever, and it's because we believe that this body is going to rise again, and so we give a lot of respect to the body. So cremation is allowed for various practical reasons, and as long as it's not you saying, I'm defying the teaching of the church, which is probably pretty rare, but probably I'd say the more common problem, though, is what you do with the remains. You're supposed to bury the remains, so you're not supposed to put grandma or auntie on the mantle or spread them out, because they're just blowing away to the four winds. Because the idea is that, we, even though they're cremated, we still have a reverence for the body, and that it's not just something to display in our house. So that's probably the more common thing. I worked at a cemetery for 2 summers, and you'd have people who would come, and it was like, oh, we have a funeral today, and the person had died like 5 years ago, and they were just now getting around to burying that, and so that's not good. But I don't know if any of you have done that, but if you do, get them in the cemetery. But that's a good question. But it is related to that teaching of why the church didn't allow that for a long time. Yeah, Dan.
I was wondering, could you explain more what you said about two judgments, like a temporary judgment at first and then the final one?
Yeah. So each of us, at the moment of our death, will experience a particular judgment, meaning our soul will be taken to heaven, or taken not to heaven, but to the divine throne room or whatever. We will be in front of Jesus, and he will judge our soul. He will, all the good things we did, all the bad things we did, and he will judge us. And again, he's a good judge. His judgments are true and just and fair. And, that's the particular judgment, and all of us will experience that at our moment of our death, or shortly thereafter. The general judgment is when Christ comes back and is revealed in glory to all of us, whether we're in heaven, on the earth, or under the earth, and he will judge the living and the dead. I thought about reading this, I didn't, but we don't have to use our imagination a whole lot with this scene, because Jesus talks about this specifically in Matthew 25. We've all heard it where he says, the Son of Man will come in glory to judge the living and the dead, and he will separate them like sheep and goats. And the goats he will place on his left, and the sheep will be on his right. And then he even tells us what the criteria is going to be. And it's what you did to the least of my brothers, you did to me. That's where he says, I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty. And both sides are going to be like, well, when did we see you hungry and naked? And he'll say, he will say, whatever you did to the least of my brothers, you did for me. So that's the general judgment. So there's two different moments in the age of our lives, but they're not opposed to each other. They're meant to kind of complement each other. There was a controversy, or not a controversy, but it wasn't clear in the early church whether or not everybody was going to have to wait to get to heaven until the general judgment. It took a while kind of for the church to work that out, but we know that we have the intercession of the saints, so they're in heaven, but they don't have their bodies yet. So St. Peter's bones, for example, are in Rome, and you can see them. They rediscovered, that's another story, but they rediscovered them, or found them, where they thought they were, but they were there in the 60s, and which is fairly recent. And so he doesn't have his body yet. St. Peter is in heaven, but so they're still waiting for that kind of final day. But yeah, that's a good question. Yes?
I have a question. So can you tell me where purgatory fits in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason why purgatory isn't specifically depicted here is because at the general judgment, at the end of time, there will be no purgatory. All of the souls in purgatory will be released from purgatory and go to heaven. All the souls on earth will either go to heaven or to hell directly. There will be no purgatory. Those who go to heaven, it will be by a special grace of Christ at the end of time that, time's up, heaven or hell, So that's why purgatory isn't depicted here, because purgatory will be no more. However, I would say that this section here is a kind of allegory of purgatory, if you will. For those of us who, will die before the second coming, there is a kind of allegory of purgatory where these souls they've been judged to be good, but they still have to make it to heaven yet, and they're still being purified as they're kind of rising to heaven. So that's why it's not depicted here, because it doesn't exist at the end of time, purgatory. There will be no purgatory anymore, because there's no need for it. But I think that you could this is kind of an allegory of purgatory, that the souls that are good are now being purified and raised to heaven. So that's where I'd say it kind of fits in here. So you could look at it as you've got heaven, hell, purgatory in this one scene. That's a great question. So.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Jesus is holding up his right hand like this. Has anything ever been discussed about that?
Yeah. Well, I'm not particularly from what I read, but usually your right hand is associated with power and authority. So, the Bible talks about God's right arm. Metaphorically, He will, in the Old Testament they talk about God bearing His arm, and it's His right arm because for most people it's the dominant hand. It's a metaphor. God doesn't actually have an arm, but Jesus does. And so, yeah. So I guess the reason why it says right hand would be, because your right hand symbolizes power and authority. That's also why, you'll hear, seated at His right hand, because if you're seated at the king's right hand, you're the right hand man, you're the most powerful person, which notice who's at his right hand is his mother. So there's symbolism with the right hand, yeah, definitely. It'd also be kind of weird if he was left hand and then twisted the other way, but yeah.
I got a question.
Sure, yeah.
When we receive communion in our hand, is there a proper hand you're supposed to receive it in?
Not particularly, no. I don't know. Not that I've seen. There is a reflection by, I don't remember who, is a saint, where he talks about presenting your hands as a throne to receive king, so it's like you're putting your hands out like a throne to receive. You're not supposed to like take it, like you're grabbing at it, but you receive it into the throne of your palm, But no, I don't think there's a particular rule
Well, I thought
about
I read
that.
something about where you receive it in your left hand and put it, with your right hand in your mouth.
Yeah.
I don't know what symbolism.
No, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. There could be. Yeah, not that I've heard about the throne thing. I think the bigger thing that I'm always concerned with is crumbs. You get crumbs on your hands. You always got to look at, if you receive communion on the hand, you always got to be careful, because if you can see the crumb, then that's the body of Jesus. And so you've maybe seen me a few times, like I'll be looking at my hand. You don't want to be a stickler about it, but if you see it, then to lick it off your hand. So, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a symbolism for that. But
Well, I was told that it's because the left hand is closer to your heart. When you pledge allegiance, you put your hand over here, or put it over there.
Yeah.
So you receive it in your left hand because that's closer to your heart.
That could be. Yeah, that could be.
And I'm just a compliment.
Yeah, no, that could be it. Yeah.
I actually read that somewhere.
Okay.
And I don't know.
Yeah. No, that could be. The other thing too is some of the symbolism is more. Some of it is more well documented or taught than others, right? I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's like Eve was taken from the side of Adam, and I don't know if you've heard this, but it's because if she was taken from his head, then she'd be above him. If she was taken from his foot, then she'd be below him. But she's taken from his side because she's his partner, and she's supposed to be close to his heart. And then you've got Christ's bride comes from the church is born from his side, and the blood and water that comes from his side. The blood represents the Eucharist. The water represents baptism. So through baptism and the Eucharist, we become Christ's bride, his spouse on the cross. So just like how, so there's a beautiful theological reflection there. That's also why, you typically, it used to be this way, I guess, and I think it is actually, no, maybe not. No, because we have the bride's side is traditionally the left side, because traditionally Eve was taken from the left side. But then when the couple turns around, now the bride is at the husband's right hand, which is the hand of power. And so there was at least some symbolism with that, where you'd put the Mary statue on the left and the Joseph statue on the right, and then the bride's side would be on the left, so it's not required, but it's kind of fun.
I always taught my students that, if you're right-handed or left-handed, whichever hand they use, whichever hand is most easiest for them to pick up and without, because you're going to cup it. And then
Yeah, I think that should be the guidance with a lot of our stuff too, is a very practical thing, if it's easier for you to do it in your left hand. I'm right-handed, so it's easier for me to grab with my right hand. So I would say I would put that pretty high as far as my considerations. If I was telling someone, if you're left-handed and it's easier for you to pick up, then do what feels comfortable. But yeah, Deacon Mitch.
Mary being the mother of God and the bride of God is kind of hard for me to get my mind.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, well, so she has a unique relationship with each of the three persons of the Trinity. She is the daughter of the Father, she's the mother of the Son, and she's the spouse of the Spirit, right? So, and we all relate to God too in a similar way. God is one, but there are also three persons in God. One God, three persons. And so there is a personal relationship with each of the three persons of the Trinity. Now, it's not three gods, but there is a way in which, like Mary, for example, and us, relates to each of the three persons differently, right? But again, like Mary is, yes, she is the mother of Christ, but she is also his first and most perfect disciple. And well, what is a disciple of Christ? Is a disciple of Christ is his spouse, his bride, right? So, by virtue of the fact that Jesus is God, like, it's not a contradiction that like she's his mother and bride, and it's obviously not like an ancestral thing. It's a metaphor, or it's an analogy to help us try to understand that she relates to him, yes, as his mother, but she also relates to him as his bride, because she, what I was talking about, I don't know if you were here 2 weeks ago, when Jesus says, who are my mother and my brother and my sisters, it's my disciples. And so she relates to him also because she bears the divine life, and she gives life away just like a mother or like a bride. So yeah, I mean, you can obviously run into some problems if you take it a little too literally, but it's trying to help us understand, like, okay, how does this marriage relate in heaven? And Mary, as the most prominent member of the church, is also the bride of Christ. But that doesn't mean we want to get weird about it either. So, all right. Well, before we go, just a couple of thank yous. Thank you to Father Jim and Father Callie, for Mary Beth, and Stacy for helping me set all this up, and to all of you for those people who brought snacks, and thanks for coming and listening. I hope it was edifying, and I hope that you learn something about the faith, and I hope that it can help you in your relationship, and as you continue on in your part of this story that we're all on. So thank you, and some of you, maybe this is goodbye, because I am leaving Friday, so go back to Rome. But thank you all. So.